Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Spirit, culture and its realm of actuality. In these two spiritual powers, then, self-consciousness recognizes its substance, content and purpose. In them it beholds its dual nature. In one it sees what it implicitly is, in the other what it is explicitly for itself. But it is at the same time, qua spirit, the negative unity of their subsistence and of the separation of individuality from the universal, or of actuality and the self. A dominion and wealth therefore confront the individual as objects, that is, as things from which he knows himself to be free, and between which he believes he can choose, or even choose neither. As this free and pure consciousness, he confronts the essence as something which is merely for him. He has then the essence qua essence within himself. In this pure consciousness, the moments of substance are for him, not state power and wealth, but the thoughts of good and bad. But further, self-consciousness is the relation of its pure consciousness to its actual consciousness, of what is in the form of thought to what exists objectively. It is essentially judgment. It is true that the immediate determination of the two sides of objective reality have already made clear which is good and which is bad. The good is state power, the bad is wealth. But this first judgment cannot be regarded as a spiritual judgment, for in it one side has been determined only as a being in itself, or as a positive, the other only as being for itself and as the negative. But as spiritual essences, each in the interfusion of both moments, as spiritual essences, each is the interfusion of both moments, and is therefore not exhausted in those determinations, and self-consciousness, which is self-related, is both in and for itself. It must therefore be related to each determination in a twofold manner, with the result that their nature, which consists in being self-alienated determinations, will be brought to light. Now, self-consciousness holds that object to be good and to possess intrinsic being in which it finds itself, and that to be bad in which it finds it the opposite of itself. Goodness is the likeness of objective reality to it, badness, however, their unlikeness. At the same time, what for self-consciousness is good and bad is intrinsically good and bad, for it is just that in which these two moments are of intrinsic being and of being for it are the same. It is the actual spirit of the objective realities, and the judgment is the proof of its power within them, a power which makes them into what they are in themselves. It is not how they are like or unlike directly in themselves, that is, not abstract being in itself or being for itself, that is their criterion and their truth, but how they are in relation of spirit to them. They are likeness or unlikeness in spirit, spirit's relation to them in virtue of which they lose their initial status of objects and develop their own self, their own inner self or intrinsic nature, becomes at the same time their reflection into themselves, through which they acquire an actual spiritual being, and what their spirit is comes to view. But just as their first immediate determination is distinct from the relation of spirit to them, so also will the third moment, their own proper spirit, be distinct from the second. First of all, their second in itself, which stems from the relation of spirit to them, must, of course, turn out to be different from the immediate in itself, for this mediation of spirit rather acts on the immediate determinateness and makes it into something else. It follows, then, that the consciousness that is in and for itself does find in the state power its simple essence and subsistence in general, but not its individuality as such. It does find there its intrinsic being, but not what it explicitly is for itself. Rather, it finds that the state power disowns action qua individual action, and subdues it into obedience. The individual, therefore, faced with this power, reflects himself into himself. It is for him an oppressor and the bad. For instead of being of like nature to himself, its nature is essentially different from that of individuality. Wealth, on the other hand, is the good. It leads to the general enjoyment, is there to be made use of, and procures for everyone the consciousness of his particular self. It is implicitly a universal beneficence, if it refuses a particular benefit and does not choose to satisfy every need. This is accidental, and it does not detract from its universal and necessary nature of imparting itself to all and being a universal provider. Oh, it's hot today. But I always wear my hat, at least when I'm making videos. Oh, where was I? 498. Yes. There's 808 altogether, by the way, in case you're wondering. These two judgments give the thoughts of good and bad a content which is the opposite of what they had for us. But self-consciousness was at first only incompletely related to its objects, namely only according to the criterion of being for self. Consciousness has equally, however, an intrinsic nature of its own, and must likewise make this aspect of a criterion, and only when it has done this is the spiritual judgment complete. According to this aspect, the state power expresses its essence. This power is in part the established law, and in part government and command, which regulates the particular activities within the action of the whole. The one is the simple substance itself, the other is its action, which animates and sustains itself and everyone. The individual thus finds therein his grounded essence, expressed, organised, and manifested. On the other hand, the individual, through the enjoyment of wealth, gains no experience of his universal nature, but only gets a transitory consciousness and enjoyment of himself, qua single and independent individual, and of the disparity between himself and his essence. The notions of good and bad thus receive here a content which is the opposite of what they had before. Each of these two ways of judging finds a likeness and a disparity. In the first case, consciousness judges the state power to be essentially different from it, and the enjoyment of wealth to account with its own nature, while in the second case it judges the state power to accord with its nature, and the enjoyment of wealth to be essentially different from it. We have before us a twofold finding of likeness and a twofold finding of disparity, an antithetical relation between the two real essentialities. We must ourselves judge these different judgments and apply to them the criterion set up. According to this, the conscious relation which finds likeness is the good, that which finds disparity is the bad, and these two forms of the relation we are henceforth to hold fast as diverse shapes of consciousness. By forming diverse relationships, consciousness itself comes to be determined as diverse as being good or bad, not because it had for its principle other being for itself, or pure being in itself, for both are equally essential moments. In the twofold judging considered above, the principles were thought of as separate, and therefore contain merely abstract ways of judging. Actual consciousness has within it both principles, and the distinction between them falls solely within its own essence, namely in the relation of itself to the actual. So, there are two antithetical forms of this relation. One is a relationship to the state power and wealth as to something of like nature to itself, the other as to something disparate from it. The consciousness which finds them of the nature to itself is noble. It sees in public authority what is in accord with itself, sees in it its own simple essence and the factual evidence of it, and in the service of the authority, its attitude towards it is one of actual obedience and respect. Similarly, in the case of wealth, it sees that this procures for it its awareness of its other essential side, the consciousness of being for itself. It therefore looks upon wealth likewise as essential in relation to itself, and acknowledges the source of its enjoyment as a benefactor to whom it lies under an obligation. The consciousness which adopts the other relation is on the contrary ignoble. It clings to the disparity between the two essentialities, thus sees in the sovereign power a fetter and a suppression of its own being for self, and therefore hates the ruler, obeys only with a secret malice, and is always on the point of revolt. It sees, too, in wealth by which it attains to the enjoyment of its own self-centered existence, only the disparity with its permanent essence, since through wealth it becomes conscious of itself merely as an isolated individual, conscious only of a transitory enjoyment, loving yet hating wealth, and with the passing of the enjoyment of something that is essentially evanescent. It regards its relation to the rich as also having vanished. I've forgotten what that game is called now. It's a French game, similar to backgammon. Anyway, I might put it in the description. I should remember, really. Anyway, I digress. Now, these relations express in the first instance the judgment, the determination of what these two essential realities are, as objects for consciousness, not as yet what they are in and for themselves. The reflection which is presented in the judgment is partly an affirmation of the one as of the other, only for us, and is therefore unequal annulling of both. It is not yet the reflection of them for consciousness itself. Partly at first they simply are essences. They have not become such, nor do they possess self-consciousness. That for which they are is not that which animates them. They are predicates which are not yet themselves subject. On account of this separation, the whole of the spiritual judgment falls apart into two consciousnesses, each of which is subject to a one-sided determination. Now, just as the first, the indifferences of the two sides, just as at first, the indifferences of the two sides of the alienation, one of which was in itself a pure consciousness, namely the specific thoughts of good and bad, the other their existence as state power and wealth, was raised into a relation between them into a judgment, so must this external relation be raised to an inner unity, or to a relation of thought to actuality, and the spirit of both forms of the judgment must make its appearance. This happens when the judgment becomes a syllogism, that is, becomes the mediating process in which the necessity and the middle term of both sides of the judgment come to view. The noble consciousness thus finds itself in the judgment confronting the state power in such a way that the latter is indeed not yet a self, but only the universal substance. It is, however, conscious of being the essence of that substance, its end and absolute content. Being so positively related to it, it adopts a negative attitude to its own ends, to its particular content and existence, and lets them vanish. This consciousness is the heroism of service, the virtue which sacrifices the single individual to the universal, thereby bringing this into existence the person, one who voluntarily renounces possessions and enjoyment and acts, and is effective in the interests of the ruling power. Through this process, the universal becomes united with existence in general, just as the merely existent consciousness through which this renunciation develops into an essential existence. That from which this consciousness alienates itself in serving the universal is the consciousness that is immersed in mere existence, that the being that is alienated from itself is the in itself. Through this development, therefore, it wins self-respect and the respect of others. The state power, however, which was at first only the universal in thought, the in itself, becomes through this very process the universal in existence, actual power. This it actually is only in the actual obedience, which it gets through self-consciousness, judging the state power to be the essence, and through the free sacrifice of self-consciousness to it. This action, which unites the essence with the self, produces the twofold actuality, the self that has a true actuality, and the state power as the true, which is acknowledged as such. Through this alienation, however, the state power is not a self-consciousness that knows itself as state power, it is only its law. or it's in itself that has authority. It has as yet no particular will, for the self-consciousness that serves the state power has not as yet renounced its own pure self and made it the active principle of the state power. It has only given that power its mere being, has only sacrificed its outer existence to it, not its intrinsic being. This self-consciousness is deemed to be in conformity with the essence and is acknowledged on account of what it intrinsically is. In it the others find their own essence exemplified, but not their own being for self, find their thought or pure consciousness fulfilled, but not their individuality. It therefore possesses authority in their thoughts and enjoys honour. It is the haughty vassal who is active on behalf of the state power, insofar as the latter is not a personal will, but an essential will, the vassal who knows himself to be esteemed only in that honour, only in the essential representation of him in general opinion, not in the gratitude shown to him by an individuality, for he has not helped this individuality to gratify his being for self. His language, were he to stand in relation to the state power, which has not yet come into being, would take the form of counsel, imparted for the general good. State power, therefore, still lacks a will with which to oppose counsel and the power to decide which of the different opinions is best for the general good. It is not yet a government, and therefore not yet in truth an actual state power. The being for self, the will, which as will is not sacrificed, is the inner separated spirit of the various classes and estates, and this, in spite of its chatter about the general good, reserves to itself what suits it its own best interest, and is inclined to make this chatter about the general good a substitute for action. The sacrifice of existence, which happened in the service of the state, is indeed complete when it has gone as far as death, but the hazard of death, which the individual survives, leaves him with a definite existence and, hence, with a particular self-interest. And this makes his counsel about what is best for the general good ambiguous and open to suspicion. It means that he has, in fact, reserved his own opinion and his own particular will in face of the power of the state. His conduct, therefore, conflicts with the interest of the state and is characteristic of the ignoble consciousness which is always on the point of revolt. This contradiction, which being for self must resolve, that of the disparity between its being for self and the state power, is at the same time present in the following form. That renunciation of existence, when it is complete, as it is in death, is simply a renunciation. It does not return into consciousness. Consciousness does not survive the renunciation, is not in and for itself, but merely passes over into its unreconciled opposite. Consequently, the true sacrifice of being for self is solely that in which it surrenders itself as completely as in death. Yet in this renunciation, no less preserves itself, it thereby becomes in actuality what it is in itself, becomes the identical unity of itself and of its opposed self. The separated inner spirit, the self as such, having come forward and renounced itself, the state power is at the same time raised to the position of having a self of its own. Without the renunciation of self, the deeds of honour, the deeds of the noble consciousness, and the counsels based on its insight would retain the ambiguity possessed by that a private reserve of particular intention and self-will. But this alienation takes place solely in language, which here appears in its characteristic significance. In the world of ethical order, in law and command, and in the actual world, in counsel only, language has the essence for its content, and is the form of that content, but here it has for its content the form itself, the form which language itself is, and its authoritative as language. It is the power of speech, as that which performs what has to be performed, for it is the real existence of the pure self as self. In speech, self-consciousness, qua independent separate individuality, comes as such into existence, so that it exists for others. Otherwise the I, this pure I, is non-existent, is not there. In every other expression it is immersed in a reality, and is in a shape from which it can withdraw itself. it is reflected back into itself from its action, as well as from its physiognomic expression, and dissociates itself from such an imperfect existence in which there is always at once too much as too little. Letting it remain lifeless behind language, however, contains it in its purity. It alone expresses the I itself. This real existence of the I is qua real existence, an objectivity which has in it the true nature of the I. The I is this particular I, but equally the universal I. Its manifesting is also at once the externalization and vanishing of this particular I, and as a result, the I remains in its universality. The I that utters itself is hard to The I that utters itself is heard or perceived. It is an infection in which it has immediately passed into unity with those for whom it is a real existence. It is a universal self-consciousness. That it is perceived or heard means that its real existence dies away. This, its otherness, has been taken back into itself, and its real existence is just this, that as a self-consciousness now, as a real existence, it is not a real existence. And through this vanishing, it is a real existence. This vanishing is thus itself at once its abiding. It is its own knowing of itself, and its knowing itself as a self that has passed over into another self that has been perceived and is universal. Spirit obtains this actuality here because the extremes of which it is the unity are also directly determined as being actualities on their own account. Their unity is broken up into two rigid, unyielding sides, each of which is for the other an actual object excluded from it. Consequently, the unity appears as a middle term, which is excluded and distinct from the separated actual existence of the sides. It has therefore itself an actual objective existence distinct from its sides and has reality for them. That is, it is something that exists. The spiritual substance enters as such into existence only when it has gained for its two sides self-consciousness, which know this pure self as an actual existence being immediate validity, and in knowing this are also immediately aware that they are such actual existences only through the mediation of their self-alienation. Through that pure self, the moments of substance are so far purified as to be the self-knowing category and thus to be moments of spirit. Through this mediation, spirit comes to exist qua spirit as a reality. It is thus the middle term which presupposes those extremes and is created by their existence. But, equally, it is the spiritual whole issuing forth between them which tunnels itself into them, and only by means of this contact creates each into the whole in terms of its own principle. The fact that both extremes are already implicitly reduced to moments and set apart produces a unity, and this is the process which brings both into a unity, interchanges their determinations, and unites them in each extreme. This mediation thus posits the notion of each of the two extremes in its actuality, or makes what each is in itself into its spirit. The two extremes, the state power and the noble consciousness, are split up by the latter, the state power into the abstract universal, which is obeyed, and into the self-centered will, which, however, does not yet conform to the universal, and the noble consciousness into the obedience rendered by the existence, which is not self-centered, or the intrinsic being of self-respect and honour, and into the still unsurrendered being for self, the will that still reserves its independence. The two moments into which both sides are purified, and which therefore are moments of language, are the abstract universal, called the general good, and the pure self, which, in serving the state, renounced its own many and various interests. Both are essentially the same, for pure self is just the abstract universal, and consequently their unity is expressed as their middle term. But the self is at first actually only in consciousness, is the one extreme, while the in itself is actual only in the state power, the other extreme. What consciousness lacks is the actual transference to it of the state power, and not merely in the form of honour. And what is lacking in the state power is that it should be obeyed, not merely as the so-called general good, but as the will, or that it should endow the self with the power of decision. The unity of the notion in which the state power still stands, and into which consciousness has been purified, becomes actual in this process of mediation, the simple existence of which it, as middle term, is language. However, the sides of the unity are not yet selves, which exist as selves, for the state power has yet to be energized into a self. This language is therefore not yet spirit, that completely knows and expresses itself.